Disciples. Thousands of dismembered bodies littered the landscape. The once green fields were now red with blood. Nearly one-third of the realm lords who lived at the center had been wiped out in a battle that had lasted less than 30 minutes. But Dacheldor was only interested in one of them. Doomsday's lifeless body sat heavily in Dacheldor's arms. He stared at her, his eyes intense with purpose. His long, black, now visible tentacles stretched out behind him nearly 3 times the length of his body. His mind raced to remember a conversation he once had with his former teacher, Prime the Fireside. He could remember speaking to Prime in a giant observatory just after his transformation into an Illithel. For the first time, Prime showed pride in his student, at least as much pride as a wraith-like being could show. The two were now members of the same species. Prime's experiment to make another Illithel was successful. Dacheldor could remember wondering why Prime had asked to speak to him alone. His training was officially over, and he had thought Prime would have preferred to be rid of him. Prime stood tall in his red samurai armor that concealed the fact that his body was nothing but living shadow. He turned to face Dacheldor, his yellow, stone-like eyes shining through the mask over his face.
Now that you are an Illithel, I have a lot I need to explain.
This had been the night Dacheldor learned the whole truth about Prime's plans, why Prime had chosen to turn him into an Illithel, and how Prime had been manipulating elements of his life for years. But that was not all he learned. Prime explained what it meant to be an Illithel. He explained an array of abilities that Dacheldor would gain as the Illithel soul inside him matured. Among these was the ability to create disciples.
This body is my primary body,
Prime explained.
That is why I call it Prime. Your current body is your primary body. As a fledgling Illithel, you can only exist in your primary body, but you will soon be able to take on other bodies as well. Those bodies are called disciples.
Prime explained that a true Illithel exists both outside of his primary body and inside it at once. The part of an Illithel that stays outside of his primary body is connected to the cosmos in a way that allows it to exist everywhere at once. If manifesting in the material world, this part of the Illithel will look like a collection of eyes, mouths, and tentacles, while the part of the Illithel inside a primary body will exist as that body. This connection to the outer cosmos allows the Illithel and his primary body to connect to other willing beings and transform them into his disciples. Once a being becomes a disciple, he or she shares the thoughts and emotions of the Illithel from that point forward. He or she also shares the Illithel's powers, and the Illithel shares the powers of his disciples. Thus, all disciples and the Illithel's primary body share each other's thoughts and abilities for all time. An Illithel must be cautious about choosing disciples, because once a disciple is chosen, the Illithel's mind can never be unlinked from the disciples. They will forever share in all things, and too many minds can create issues. Prime personally chose to only create 12 of his own disciples for just this reason. Now, standing in the center of thousands of corpses, holding Doomsday in his arms, Dacheldor wondered if he had evolved enough to take the next step as an Illithel. One of his black tentacles twisted and curved up over his head. Its tip pointed straight down at Doomsday's heart. "This has to work," he told himself. The tentacle struck, breaking through her ribcage, and then transformed into a black mist. The mist, which resembled the mist Dacheldor's body transformed into when he was injured, filled Doomsday's body. As it did, a new tentacle grew out of Dacheldor's back to replace the one that had disappeared. Doomsday's body twitched and convulsed. Though she had been dead moments ago, she was now being filled with a power mirroring Dacheldor's immortality curse. Internally, she saw something no one else saw. In this moment, call it a hallucination, she could see as if she were not blind. A white gate hovered in the sky a short distance away. Its doors were open, and a beautiful light shined from it. Doomsday felt only love and peace from beyond the gate, but she hesitated to move toward it. She stood on what appeared to be a long road that hovered in the sky. At one end of the road was the gate. At the other end was her body. Then something appeared next to her on the road. An inky black squid-like creature with multiple eyes and mouths that was larger than Doomsday could fathom appeared to her. It spoke in a voice that shook all reality.
"Stay and become my disciple."
"What?" Doomsday asked. But as she did, her mind was filled with an understanding of exactly what that meant. "Dacheldor, is that you?"
"Do not die, Doomsday. Return. Become my disciple."
She looked out at the gate, knowing full well what it signified. She looked back at the creature. "Is this your true form?"
"Stay and share my powers. Stay and become immortal."
She hesitated. Outside of the hallucination, Dacheldor held Doomsday close. "Come back to me, Doomsday," he said. "Don't die." Prime had explicitly said disciples shared the powers of the Illithel they were joined to. In Dacheldor's case, that included his immortality. "Come back to me," Dacheldor said again. Doomsday gasped as her eyes opened. In an instant, her thoughts became known to Dacheldor. This was not as it normally was for him, when he reached out to hear what others were thinking. Dacheldor felt as if he actually was Doomsday, thinking and feeling everything she thought and felt. Doomsday experienced the same thing, but with Dacheldor's thoughts. Through his eyes, she was even able to see. She screamed as her own memories of the past timelines filled her mind. Since Dacheldor was an aberration, she now was as well. She gasped as she became aware of their past across the various timelines. Dacheldor set Doomsday's feet down on the ground, and she stood, staring at him. Every thought, every memory, every emotion between them was shared. In an instant, Doomsday knew exactly how in love Dacheldor was with her, and he felt her love back. The emotion was more intense than any the two could ever feel alone. Doomsday turned away. Dacheldor's love for Kara was now her own. She understood how deeply he loved them both, and could not bear to hurt Kara. For now, at least, she would do her best to subdue her urges, and he would do the same. Darkfire was astonished to see Dacheldor had managed to bring her back to life, and asked how it was possible. As Dacheldor explained, Kara approached and overheard the truth. Doomsday was now and forever bound to Dacheldor as his disciple. Their minds and abilities were forever linked. Kara was outraged at what Dacheldor had done, even though Doomsday adamantly swore she would not get between Kara and Dacheldor. Kara screamed at her. "You always have been between us, whether you know it or not." She also screamed at Dacheldor, yelling about how often he had let other important people die for the greater good, but here, now, he had to sacrifice everything for Doomsday. "Hypocrite!" she shouted. An explosion rang out from inside the school, interrupting the conversation. None of them had realized moments before Dharmal had run inside with Shakarok close behind. Inside his room, Dharmal had flipped over his bed to reveal a complex circle and sigil etched into the wood beneath it. Laced with special artifacts and oils, he had been collecting and developing this sigil in secret throughout the past year. The last ingredient needed was to activate it while an Illithol was near with its tentacles revealed. Dharmal slammed his hand on the sigil and beheld Tezenkrul in his true form. He stared into the mass of darkness, stars, eyes, mouths, and tentacles. He uttered the words, "I release you." Tezenkrul emerged from the circle, freed from his prison, and entered Dharmal's body. Dharmal had agreed to become Tezenkrul's disciple and to carry him in his body until a suitable primary body could be found. Dharmal gasped as the knowledge and abilities of a true Illithol became his. He now rivaled Dacheldor in power. Shakarok threw open the door to the room and found Dharmal kneeling in the center of the circle. Long black tentacles now protruded from his back. He saw the look of betrayal on Shakarok's face, and it angered him. Lifting an arm, he shot an intense bolt of black electricity right through Shakarok, blowing the room up around them as he did. This was the explosion the others had heard. They ran toward the school to see what had happened. Dacheldor was the farthest ahead, sensing the presence of an Illithol within. Shakarok's body dropped in a charred husk. Dacheldor turned the corner in time to see Dharmal standing in the center of the debris, with the tentacles exposed. Dharmal laughed, then shot through the roof of the school and flew into the distance. Dacheldor knelt over Shakarok's corpse. The same desire grew in him that he had with Doomsday. He arched his tentacle over Shakarok and said, "Let's see if I can pull this off twice." The tentacle struck. Shakarok's mind filled with odd visions of places and people he had never seen. More than 2 billion years of Dacheldor's life danced before his eyes, becoming a shared memory. Shakarok was Dacheldor, and Dacheldor was Shakarok. Then there was something more. Doomsday's life, starting with her blind childhood, leading to her conquest of her home planet, and continuing up through her training as a Realm Lord and romance with Dacheldor, became a part of Shakarok's memories as well. The three were now connected in a way unlike any other. Every thought one made became the thoughts of the others. Shakarok saw his own life through the eyes of both Dacheldor and Doomsday, and did not recognize all of it. This was because both had memories of a past timeline that he did not. Viewing that alternate life brought on a seizure-like experience, followed by a steady flow of memories from this previous timeline. By the end of these memories, Shakarok had become an aberration. He remembered meeting Dacheldor for the first time and being tested in a similar fashion to how he had been tested in the current timeline. He remembered training, becoming a Realm Lord, and eventually specializing in the art of Realm Lord defense. He remembered taking his place as Dacheldor's second-in-command in their squad. He remembered fighting with Dacheldor over his arrogant self-righteousness, and sometimes helping him to see the errors of his ways. He remembered sharing relaxing moments with Dacheldor, drinking ale on faraway worlds, and getting into trouble. He remembered a war in which all of the Realm Lords perished, and Dacheldor had become a monster. As his body regenerated from a black mist, his eyes were wide open. He remembered everything about who he was and who he had been, who Dacheldor was and who he had been, and who Doomsday was and who she had been. Dacheldor and Doomsday shared this as well. The three now shared a unique bond that could never be broken. Shakarok stood as his body finally solidified. Dacheldor closed his eyes in a solemn fashion. He had never planned on turning Doomsday and Shockrock into aberrations, and had definitely not planned to make them his disciples. These two things could now never be undone.